All right, Merry Christmas, everybody. Man, we're so glad that you're here with us tonight. Thank you for choosing to spend your Christmas Eve with us. We're glad that you're here. And if you're a guest with us tonight, we're especially glad that you're here. Hope that you can relax, be yourself, and have a good time. And just know you're among friends here. And just a quick note of housekeeping really quickly. If you are a guest, we'd love for you to fill out this card. And if you take it by our guest desk, we have a gift for you. You can go by the guest desk without a card. We'll still give you a gift probably. So, but if you would do that, we'd love that. And we're just glad that you all are here and glad that it's Christmas Eve. Can you believe that already? It's Christmas Eve, which means tomorrow is Christmas, which means if you have young children, Christmas starts a little earlier for you than everyone else, kind of in the wee hours of the morning. And so for me, my wife, Katie, and I, we have two kids, Marley and Campbell. And so we're personally hoping for, well, I'm personally hoping for about a 7 a.m. start time tomorrow. But I know that would be a Christmas miracle if that happens. And so that's not going to happen. So I'm not getting my hopes up too far for that. But you know, in spite of all the craziness of this season, you know, the early hours, the busyness, the long lines, the shopping, I still love this time of year. You know, all the excitement, the anticipation, especially now that we have kids, the traditions, the childhood memories, all the Christmas movies and the presents, all of those things. There's just something about Christmas that is special, just is set apart than the other holidays, I think. And so Christmas is a glorious season, I think, but there is one thing about Christmas that I cannot stand. Cannot stand it. Maybe you would agree with this, but wrapping presents is awful. It's not of the Lord. It's not of God. Wrapping presents is awful. I would rather get a flu shot than to wrap a present, and it's because I'm not good at it. I'm terrible at it. And so, I mean, when I finish wrapping a present, it looks like a toddler has gone crazy with the Scotch tape again. You know, like that's just what it looks like. I don't have the patience for it, and so just thinking about spending all this time and money and effort wrapping this presents just to get ripped apart in a few days, like I just don't get it. You know, but that's probably the only thing about Christmas that I don't really enjoy. I was wrapping Katie's presents on Thursday, and I really put some good effort into the first one. You know, like I was fresh, I was ready for this, and it wasn't terrible. Like it wasn't completely terrible, but then I ran out of Scotch tape. And so I tore the house apart looking for Scotch tape. I'm texting Katie, and she's like, I don't know if there's any there. So I'm looking all around, and all I can find is duct tape. All the guys are like, yeah, duct tape, you know? And in my mind, I'm thinking, Katie will not approve of me wrapping her presents with duct tape. That's not going to happen. But, you know, I thought, you know, maybe I can just do it kind of incognito, you know, just do it in such a way that it's not that noticeable. And so I gave it my best shot, you know, and sent Katie a picture of my efforts. This isn't okay. I mean, you can see like the duct tape right there. And of course, you can see her answer. And to be honest, I mean, I'm laughing while I send this to her, right? I mean, I knew this is not going to fly. But you can see her reply. She said, that ain't going under my tree. And if you know Katie, she meant that. And so anyways, I just stuck it in the stocking stuffer instead, you know. But anyways, with gift wrapping, though, Katie is like the complete opposite from me. I mean, wrapping Christmas presents is like her love language or something. I mean, she takes it really seriously. She loves it. And there's always this grand strategy in place. Like, you know, Marley gets this wrapping paper. Campbell gets this wrapping paper. I get this. Like, and you know, there's a strategy in place. The cousins get their own. I mean, you know. And so she even has this practice of laying out all of the gifts in their respective piles, right? I mean, it's like she's doing this for a mall window display. I mean, it is like immaculate what she's doing. And you know, and when she gives me my presents, I mean, I feel like she's giving me this work of art that I feel guilty tearing open. You know, I'm like, can I even open this or whatever? But I mean, it's just crazy. But now I'm glad that I could get this kind of all out of my system and share this with you. You know, this is how pastors have therapy. We just talk to you about it. But I do have a point to make with all of this. And, you know, the wrapping paper is exciting. The big bows are a hit and all of that. But on Christmas morning, there's part of the Christmas present that everybody goes to first and thinks about first. And that's the label. There's a label because the label tells you vital information that you need to know about that present. It's whether it's going to be relevant to you or not relevant to you, right? Whether it's your gift or someone else's gift. And so everybody looks for the label. Well, here at United, we've been looking at the genealogy of Jesus as we've been preparing for Christmas. Now, we'll come back to the label thing here in just a minute. But genealogy is one of those weird biblical words, right, that we don't really use that much anymore. But it basically means a family tree or a listing of ancestors, you know, from your family. And so in the book of Matthew, there's this listing of Jesus' family tree at the very beginning of the book. Now, we call this book Matthew because Matthew was the author. But Matthew was one of Jesus' disciples, which means he talked with Jesus for 3 years. He heard all the stories. He heard all the teaching. He saw all the miracles. I mean, he was there with him in the flesh. And so Matthew decides to write all of that stuff down into a book so that these stories and these teachings of Jesus could be captured and shared with a bunch of people and shared with others. And so Matthew was Jewish. You need to know that too. And he wrote this book specifically for Jewish people. But Matthew starts off his book with this genealogy, this family tree. But he does it for a specific reason, because for the Jewish people, they believed their Messiah was going to come through a certain line, through the line of Abraham, through the line of David, through their family tree. And so Matthew writes this genealogy to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's coming from the right family tree, and that he fulfilled all those requirements. And so here's how it starts. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, and so on, and so on, and so on. 17 verses of this. You know, so-and-so was the father of so-and-so. And I mean, really stimulating reading, really. But when you look at Matthew's genealogy, you see that Matthew has emphasized the right people, right? Abraham's there. King David is there. You know, all the important people. Jacob is there. Joseph and Mary are there a little bit later. Now, in our culture, genealogies are not the most exciting reading, right? I mean, it kind of reads like an accountant's ledger. But for the Jews who would have read this back in Matthew's day, this genealogy of Jesus would have been nothing short of scandalous and controversial. Like, it would have caused a stir in the town. Because back then, when you wrote a genealogy, you didn't include everybody in the family tree. You just couldn't do it. It's too many people. So genealogies were almost always selective. You chose who got in and who didn't get in, right? And so, of course, most people chose to include the good people. You know, the people that make you look good. And you selectively left out the bad or embarrassing relatives. Now, do you have a relative that you would like to selectively leave out? Please, don't raise your hand, whatever you do. But we know kind of where he's coming from on that. But Matthew's genealogy here is selective. And so he seems to go out of his way to include all the bad people in Jesus' family tree. He brings out all the black sheep. He drags out all the skeletons from his family. He includes 4 women in the genealogy. Now, genealogies typically didn't have women in them because they couldn't own land back then or own property. But he includes 4 women, and 3 of those 4 weren't even Jewish. So first of all, that would have been like, whoa, okay, why are you doing that? And then he also made sure to mention King David, like their national hero. He mentions his adultery with Bathsheba in the genealogy. He goes out of his way to mention Judah, who was like the ringleader of his brothers that sold his brother Joseph into slavery. So Judah was basically a human trafficker. Matthew includes Tamar, who's this woman who pulled some R-rated stunts to trick her father-in-law into protecting her. This genealogy is like 17 verses long, but then in verse 18, so the first one after the genealogy, Matthew makes sure that he shares the bombshell that Jesus' mom, Mary, was an unmarried, expecting, pregnant, most likely teenage mom. Now, in the culture of that day, getting pregnant before you were married, that was a capital offense. I mean, Mary could have been stoned for that. Matthew puts it in. This is how Matthew begins his book, his bestseller. This is how Matthew introduces Jesus to the world. I mean, if you and I were going to introduce Jesus to our friends or to our family or to our people in a room, I mean, would we want to drag out all of the skeletons from his family? I mean, probably not, right? We want to talk about the good things. So why does Matthew do this as he prepares to introduce Jesus to the world? I mean, it's crazy, the things that he puts in this genealogy. But it's because Matthew knew that not only were these embarrassing relatives with the sinful reputations part of Jesus' story and part of his family tree, more importantly, they are the point of Jesus' story. And we'll dig into that a little bit. But this is the scandal of Christmas. It's found in this genealogy. So in Matthew's day, much like in ours, following God was more about your religious or spiritual performance. Based on what you do or don't do, how people followed God became based on a list of what is acceptable and unacceptable, how well you could keep a set of laws or keep a set of rules. And so if you were a good rule keeper, you were considered holy or worthy or good, right? But if you didn't keep the rules, you were an outcast. You didn't make the cut. And so it's as if Matthew wants to begin his book by leveling the playing field for us. He's lived with Jesus for 3 years. He's seen it. He has touched him. He's seen him. He's talked to him. And he knows that the religion of spiritual performance is not what God intended. And he knew that that's what Jesus had come to talk about. There are not good rule abiders. There are not pure people and impure people. In humanity's family tree, there are only sinners. And so as Matthew prepares to tell this story of Jesus, he brings out all of these names with baggage. And in so doing, Matthew reminds us that we come to God based on what God has done, not on what we have done. We come to God through a relationship, not through a set of rules or a set of laws. But this turned the religion of the day on its head. And so for the first time, how good we are or how well we perform spiritually or religiously is no longer the issue. But we all know something about this though, right? I mean, it's a difficult transition to follow God out of love rather than following him out of duty. That's a hard transition to make. If I just do this, I know that God will be pleased with me. Or if I just don't do that, God will accept me. But do you know what I've learned about God and me and my relationship with him is that anytime my approach to God is based on me and my performance, I never have peace. I never have peace. I might have this moment of achievement and pride and success that temporarily makes me feel good, but I won't have peace. I've learned that coming to God out of self, out of performance, is destructive, and it robs me of peace. And so as Matthew is preparing to tell the greatest story ever told, he begins with this genealogy that we read earlier. And then we read this in verse 5. He mentions a couple names here. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. So he's going through a bunch of names. He's already kind of stirred the pot with several names at this point, 5 verses in. But especially this one, verse 5. Now, if you have spent any time in Sunday school or in church, You might know Rahab. You might know her nickname, or you might know that Rahab had a label attached to her name, right? I mean, having a label is not that unusual for us, right? I mean, we operate in a world of labels. Other people in the Scripture have labels too. I mean, we got John the Baptist, right? We got Uriah the Hittite, Alexander the Great, Attila the Hun, Conan the Barbarian, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Jabba the Hutt. Those last few are not in the Bible, really. But you get what I'm saying. There's labels there, right? We understand labels. And we all probably relate with some label or another, or been labeled in some way, right? Democrat, Republican, boomer, millennial. Millennial is like a dirty word now. Have you noticed that? Oh, you millennial. You know, I'm like, come on. Poor, wealthy, middle class, white, black, Hispanic. I mean, these are all labels that we're familiar with. And so Rahab's label was a derogatory one. It was one that described her profession, her job. And then her job wasn't one that you were proud of, because she was Rahab the prostitute. And she's included here in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. And this was wrong on so many levels for the Jewish people, for Matthew to be including her. And one's the obvious one, right? I mean, she was a prostitute. But the other thing is that Rahab wasn't even Jewish. She was a Canaanite, who were the enemies of the Jewish people. And so Matthew could have skipped Rahab, in the family tree. He could have just not talked about her. But he includes to put her in. He intentionally includes her. And so her story is told in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. And in Joshua, Israel is a new nation. They've left Egypt, where they were slaves. And now they're preparing to take the land that had been promised to them, called the land of Canaan. And so Israel's leader Joshua, he decides to send 2 spies into this key city in Canaan just to check it out, right? The city of Jericho, you've probably heard of that. Before they attack it, they wanted to spy it out. So the 2 spies arrive in the city, and they're quickly discovered. So they must not be very good spies, but it's the best he had, so we sent them in. And so, they're being chased, and so they duck into the house of a prostitute named Rahab. And so the king of Jericho demands a search for these guys, and so the king's soldiers go looking house to house, and so they come to Rahab's house and talk to her and ask if she's seen the spies. And we pick up the story here. It says, "But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, 'Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. And at dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, the men left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up to them.'" And so the king's men leave Rahab, and they keep searching, keep looking for the spies, and she's hidden them in her home. And so we keep going with the conversation here once the king's men leave. And she says this to the spies. She says, "I know that the Lord has given this land to you." Now, this is a Canaanite prostitute, so hang in here with me. This is a Canaanite prostitute, and she acknowledges the God of the Jewish people. Now, Bible scholars are not really sure how this happened, but the word that Rahab uses here for God was one of the most sacred, rarely spoken names for God for the Jewish people. It was the Jewish name for God, and so she's using their language. And it means literally the existing one. And so Rahab is making it clear she knows something greater than man is at work here. And she says this, she says, "A great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea when you came out of Egypt. And when we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." And so Rahab shares her belief with these guys that this God of Israel is the existing one, the supreme ruler in heaven and on earth. And so the spies tell her, "Rahab, okay, listen, we promise not to harm you. Our lives for your lives," the men assured her. "If you don't tell us If you don't tell what we're doing, if you don't rat us out, we won't rat you out. We will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. And so soon after this exchange with Rahab, the Battle of Jericho happens. And you probably remember this battle, right? It's pretty interesting. They march around the city 7 times, and they blow their trumpets and whatnot, and the walls come tumbling down, like the old song says. And so when this happens, you can just imagine living in a walled city, what kind of chaos might be going on if walls are like crumbling around you and falling down. I mean, there would have been tremendous rubble and loss of life. It would have been fear and panic and all of these things happening. And God reaches down into these circumstances and he preserves Rahab, the prostitute. Joshua 6 says, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men that Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. Now this is an amazing story in the Old Testament. But in the story we have a woman who's a prostitute. She's not even a Jew. And the God of mercy spares her life and the lives of her family. And I love the phrase at the end of this, that she lives among the Israelites to this day, which means she was also received by God's community too, his people. Rahab became part of the Jewish people in spite of her label. Now later in the story, we know that Rahab married a guy named Salmon. So Salmon was a Jew who marries this Canaanite woman, a retired prostitute, I guess, by this point. And Rahab and Salmon have a baby, and they name him Boaz. If you're looking for any good baby names, Boaz is a good one. So Boaz, when Boaz is older, he meets a woman named Ruth. And the great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz is King David. And so for the Jewish people, this was a national story. This is something they knew. This was like how we know about President Lincoln getting assassinated. This was a national story, right? Everybody knew it. And they'd be like, hey, tell us the story of Rahab the prostitute and how she became the great-grandmother of King David. Tell us that one again. And so Matthew writes it into the genealogy. Matthew 1. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. And this is how Rahab becomes part of the genealogy of Jesus. And is there for all the world to see. A black sheep in the line of the Messiah. No pure bloodlines, no perfect families, no pretense, no image management here. It's out there for the world to see it. And the message of Scripture here is that God is saying, my grace completes my law. My mercy is broader than my judgment. And what's cool is that Rahab the prostitute, she's mentioned 2 more times in Scripture in the New Testament because of her faith. Once in Hebrews and once in James. Now, Rahab's story is not that different than our story, right? I mean, Rahab carried a label around with her, and most of us know what it is to carry a label around with us. I mean, what's your label? What would be your label? Driven, poor, divorced, X, overachiever, underachiever, distant, irresponsible, self-centered, hard to get along with, busy, workaholic, aloof, obnoxious, needy, addicted, aimless. There's a lot of labels we carry. And for some of us, your label keeps you from God. Self-righteous, judgmental, jealous, greedy, lust, cheat, unfaithful, secretive. Now, why would Matthew, as he prepares to tell the story of Jesus, include Rahab the prostitute here? Why would he do it? Matthew had a label too, didn't he? If you remember Matthew's story, before he was Matthew the disciple, he was Matthew the tax collector, which was a hated profession. And you know, the irony in all of this is that the baby Jesus that we're celebrating tonight would also be labeled to the point of death. A drunkard, they call him a troublemaker, a traitor, friend of sinners, a threat, criminal, and finally guilty. But you know what's interesting is when Jesus called Matthew to follow him, he didn't ask Matthew to give up his label and follow him. He didn't ask Matthew to clean up his reputation or erase his past. All the text records is the invitation to follow. He says, Matthew, follow me. Follow me. Now, doesn't the story of Rahab and Matthew and Jesus here, doesn't it move you to reconsider your approach to God? I mean, Christmas is a story of God doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. You can't get clean enough to come to God because that's not based on your cleanliness. It's based on His forgiveness and His grace. And that's good news because there's no way that you and I could ever be clean enough, good enough, worthy enough on our own to be worthy of God and to come to Him. And so if that's not possible, then God had to take another approach to reach us if He wanted us to be with Him. And that's exactly what He did. And so a relationship with God begins this way. We respond. That's it. We respond. We respond to God's invitation to a relationship. And that's the first step, the initial step. We don't bring anything else to that step. There's nothing else for us to put on the table except a desire to relate to God and a willingness to ask for forgiveness. That's where it starts. There's no other requirement. Just a willingness to respond to Him. And so from here, you and God and your new relationship begin to chip away at all those behaviors and thoughts and attitudes that you really don't want a part of you anyway, right? And eventually you find yourself so in love with God that you would do nothing knowingly to hurt Him or your relationship with Him, to put distance between you and God. One of the greatest misconceptions in the church, I think, is that we think that it all started with us, right? We found God. We searched for Him. But the story of Christmas reminds us is that it started with God, in spite of what we do. We didn't find Him. He found us. He pursued us. And so the good news of Christmas is that God's grace is more powerful than your label or my label. Christ's birth, His life, His death, His resurrection are far more powerful than any label that you and I carry. And through Jesus, I've been given a new label. And you can have a new label too. I don't know what label you walked in with today. I have no idea. But I know that you can walk out with a label of forgiven, accepted, belonging, loved, child of God, redeemed, restored, made new. All of these labels can be yours and can be mine. Because the scandal of Christmas is that the almighty, holy God of heaven and earth left that heaven to come and be born in a manger, a feeding trough, to pursue you and to pursue me. To give us the offer of a relationship with him. All we have to do is stop saying no. Stop saying no. And say yes. And say yes. God, I don't understand it all, but I want to know what it is to have a relationship with you. Because honestly, nothing else is working in my life. God, I'm not all cleaned up, but will you come into my heart and my life and show me what it means to know you? And he will answer that prayer. He will answer that prayer. And should you decide to pray that prayer today, I would just like to ask you to let us know so we can help you get started in that relationship. You can write it on your guest card. You can talk to me. However you want to do it. You can turn your guest card in at the desk, I guess. I don't know. But let us know so we can help you begin that relationship with him.